Our lesson today is taken from the book of Acts, the second chapter. To situate it, this is after Pentecost, after Peter has given his long sermon, and it's the first look we have at Christian church with the Holy Spirit as part of the makeup. It's no longer the people hidden in the upper room. It's no longer the visions of Jesus here and there after the resurrection. It's no longer even the traveling disciples and followers when Jesus was alive. This is a different entity. This is the beginning of Christianity, the gathering of people who have this shared belief in one God, one Christ, one Spirit. And it gives us a very idealistic understanding of what the early church looked like. And many want to dismiss idealism as if it's non-historical. In fact, Acts is known as the history book of the New Testament, of the Christian scriptures. And many want to assume that it's giving a vision that just couldn't possibly have existed at the time. And I'd really want to challenge that, because just because something is idealistic and not sustainable doesn't mean it wasn't real. And the image of community, of people gathering their wealth, gathering their families, being in one place together. It comes up again in chapter 4, verse 32, I believe, of Acts. It's a recurring theme, but it's not just a recurring theme within the Christian scriptures. It's a recurring theme in the entirety of the 2,000 years of Christianity. We see it again and again. It's the model for convent and monastic life. It's the model for intentional communities that gather, so many through history. Even into the 21st century, we have communities of people who live together, who worship together, who come together. Maybe it's not full time, maybe it's just for an extended weekend, but it works. And this is an opportunity for us to just kind of delve into that a little bit more. What can the Christian community look like? Does it have to be restricted to a building with a group of people up at the front of the church doing their thing, professional or not professional, and everybody seated respectfully in pews, being essentially talked at? Very little integration of the community, and then get up and go. Is that church? That actually is the aberration, not the description of the community that we find in Acts 2. So let's unpack it a little bit. What was going on in Acts 2? What was the community looking like? We have a very, very short description where everybody had sold their extra goods, they had combined their wealth, they were giving money to poor folk, they were giving money to widows, orphans, whoever needed it, and they were living together. And they were worshiping together, and they were eating together. And some would go celebrate in the temple and worship in the temple, and then they'd come home, and they would eat, and they would pray, and they would talk, and they would study. And the next day they'd get up and do it all over again. That is church. Even if we don't physically do it, that is church. The reality is that we've lost the message of Acts 2 and how the church can be to each other. And this pandemic is kind of challenging that again, because we're not physically able to get to each other. And that really limits how we can express our community. But it's also pushing us to really reevaluate what that community looked like. I mean, just imagine it. Mary Magdalene sitting with a bunch of teenage girls going over the financial books of the community. Because in that time, Hebrew culture, women were responsible for the household finances, not the men. It was a woman's job. So she'd be teaching these women about accounting and about good economy and about household responsibilities and about purchasing things. We can envision John and Matthew and James in the temple coming back home, and children just running around them. What did you do? What did you talk about? Tell me more about it. You can imagine Peter coming in and, with an elderly person on his arm, helping them over to where they sat. That was community. That was the vision of church, that we were all in this together, that we were not divided by economic lines. We weren't divided by age. We weren't divided by status. everybody was together. And it's a dream that has come up again and again and again through history. And not coincidentally at all, often it has come up after a pandemic. Pandemics change the world around us. Anybody who had the delusion a month ago that we were all just going to lock down for a short bit and get back to business as usual, I think there's kind of letting go of that vision. When we are finally able to be integrated in society again, like we were just 2 months ago, it's not going to be the same. We're not going to be able to do the same things we had done before. And I think slowly that's kind of coming into the modern consciousness. You see more of that referencing on social media. You see more of that coming out of politicians. You see more of people accepting that a new norm is going to have to emerge, a new way of looking at economy, a new way of looking at food security, a new way of looking at politics, a new way of looking at taxation. We're looking at governments who have the money to support people. Are we really going to go back to a world where they tell us they don't have enough? I don't think so, because we know that now. The door has been opened. And we can see the couple of countries that haven't done that and the devastation that is going on in those countries. We have called to a new way of doing things. And Christians, we're really well positioned to be able to do that because we already have a lifestyle of committing to each other and sharing with each other. One of the pandemics of the Middle Ages brought forth a group of women called the Beguines. They lived in Northern Europe for the most part, down towards France. When I was in Belgium, in Bruges, I had an opportunity of going into a béguinage, which is a housing where these women had lived communally. Many of them had lost their husbands in the plague. They had, or they hadn't married. There was not enough resources around, so they combined their resources. Now, this was not a registered order like convents would be. This is lay women who brought their children in, who brought their elderly mothers in, who were in community. And it was a fluid community. People came and they went and they returned and they didn't. And there's writings going on, and it was highly spiritual. But this is a group of women who responded in a Christian community after a horrible thing had happened to society, and they became family to each other. And one of the really interesting things that I saw when I was there is a backdrop of one of the main houses in Bruges had tiles behind the stove. And the tiles depicted Bible stories that were primarily those of women. So they were teaching their young about how women were living in community, living their faith. The reason that's so exciting and almost surprising is that this is a time when almost all the stained glass, all the decoration, all the art showed a very limited representation of women and deferred to men. And unfortunately, too much of art does. We have Mary, Mother of Jesus, being highlighted, and everything else is pretty well about the men. So the fact that the women at that time were able to show other women in the Bible and show the community that they brought was quite powerful. But these were women who responded to a pandemic, and they changed how they lived. We don't even have to keep it back in history. We can bring it forward. Not that the pandemic changed much, but in the flu epidemic 100 years ago, which everybody is talking about right now, one of the communities that came out of that, not necessarily directly, but at the same time, was known as the Catholic Worker Movement. Dorothy Day, she created this environment where people helped each other, and it really made a difference during the Depression, when people needed to be fed, needed to have support, needed to have places to go, libraries to read, things to do when work was scarce and they weren't sure how it was going to work. Christians created community. And it isn't just a historic thing then either. I was able just 20 years ago to live in a Catholic worker. They still exist because Christians are still called to gather in community. There's a conference that happens every May. It's in Ontario. It's led by the Student Christian Movement called Cahoots. I had the privilege of being a session leader there a couple of years ago. And it was, again, an opportunity for Christians from all over the place, different economic realities, to come together and celebrate and worship together and talk about their faith. And children hung off people who were not their parents. And teenagers got together and went off and did whatever teenagers do. And older folk got to sleep in or talk or eat. People shared the community responsibility for the kitchen, for cleanup, for worship, for everything. It was picture perfect example of Acts 2. We don't have to wait for what's going to happen after the pandemic is over. We can start visualizing it now. Who do we want to be? Who is powerful in this community that can show us a new way of living? If anything, this pandemic has shown us that we have to rejig our thinking. The strongest people in the world are not those who walk around with guns. In fact, as we've seen in protests in the United States in the last little while, they are the ones that look incredibly ridiculous and idiotic. The strongest people are not heavily armed. The strongest people are those with a gentle hand and a soft word and trying to make things better. The most important people in our society are not celebrities and athletes and CEOs and leaders of big corporations. They're the people who deliver groceries and stock shelves and keep the supply chains going. The people who are paid poorly and still get up every morning and do their job. We are already starting to revisualize what just society can look like. Our reading from Acts 2 gives us a footprint of what that can look like. How do we do that? How do we come out of this? How do we celebrate community? How do we get together? Maybe, it's time to say the nuclear experiment for families is truly over. Bring our seniors home to live with a family. Maybe it's time to acknowledge that the raising of children is not something to farm out, but something to share. Maybe we realize that families getting up in the morning and everybody going their separate ways is a total fail, and we should be finding ways to have the home as the center of community, not the business. These are all questions that everybody's going to have to answer for themselves. But we have some cues from the early church about how that can happen, how people can get together and talk about their faith, not just be talked at. And I realize this is a little bit of irony because that's exactly what I'm doing with you right now, is talking at you. Where are we in community as we get together to celebrate each other's knowledge, to share each other's questions, to expand who we are as Christians? Because the most profound way to develop your faith is not to attend a building and sit there for 1 hour and politely do the things you need to do. The most incredible way to grow your faith is to sit with other people, other Christians, and talk about how they see things, what they believe, questions they have, things that they want to see happen. It's not a matter of putting children into one room and seniors into another room and siphoning off groups. It's about multi-generations coming together. Small group movement is very, very active in a lot of churches, where people just get together on a topic. Maybe there are a bunch of athletes who get together, artists get together, people who have done mission work get together, and they talk about what their faith means to them. That's how we grow. That's how we become Christians in the world. And Acts 2 gives us that template. It is completely possible. Who cares if it's idealistic? It's a roadmap for how we can be as we emerge from our state of complete lockdown and start to integrate a little bit more fully into the world around us. We are not going back to the way things used to be. So now's a wonderful opportunity to look at the way things should be and could be, and how we want to see a world that doesn't artificially divide, but brings people together to take care of the vulnerable, share our resources, and be church to each other.